What if Russia told the world that its bargaining position in Ukraine was weaker than the public's perception, but everyone just ignored the admission? Well, that is basically where we are at right now. You will remember the Steve Witkoff leak that garnered a huge amount of attention because it showed him coaching a Russian diplomat on how best to win Trump's favor. But there was a second leak that came out simultaneously between the aforementioned diplomat and one of his Kremlin compatriots. And the implications of this second leak are far more strategically interesting. So, today, I want to go over the transcript of the leak and what is actually being said, because without context, it is a bit of a jumbled mess. I will then situate the central lessons from there into the coercive bargaining happening right now, which reveals an important lines-based inference that Western countries are not currently acting on. Then we will explore what the leaked information tells us about what is likely in an intelligence report somewhere, but is not yet publicly available. That will take us to an important trade-off between acquiring intelligence from a source and actually exploiting that information. And we will conclude by moving away from the leaks and to the intelligence that the West could declassify that would further shape the narrative and would make things even more spicy. Speaking of narrative, though, here you go. Putin says Russia will take all of Ukraine's Donbas region, militarily or otherwise. Now, it is easy to jump to the warning to not listen to what leaders say, but rather watch what they do. Except Russia is still doing by rejecting proposals, continuing to endure the costs of war, and making battlefield progress. So we ought to at least entertain the possibility that Russia either thinks that the full capture of the Donbas is the expected military outcome of a full conflict, or Putin is so politically constrained that he will not stop fighting until the Donbas is his, or he is no longer president. Either way, Russia would have increased bargaining leverage here. The more willing one is to reject offers for any reason, the more the other side has to give up to reach a deal. If we want to separate bluffs from reality, it sure would be nice if we had direct insights from the Kremlin. Oh, what is this? Why, it's direct insights from the Kremlin. Now, the existence of a leak, generally speaking, was hard to miss. There were more than 400 news sources covering the topic. The problem is that the primary narrative focused on the leaked conversation featuring Steve Witkoff. He being a Trump administration official, the situation immediately activated political partisanship. The left focused on Witkoff's plotting with Russia to the detriment of Ukraine. The right aimed to discredit the attacks on Witkoff's motives. But it was the center that tended to bring into the fold Kirill Dmitriev, one of the conversing parties from the second leak. It is the type of thing that is easy to miss if you do not diversify your news consumption. But good news! That is exactly what Ground News, the sponsor of today's video, is for. You not only will see the key headlines for the day, you will also see how the headlines vary according to who is publishing them. And by going to ground.news/linesonmaps, or scanning the QR code on your screen, you can take 40% off a Vantage plan. That is what I use to access all of this information and more. So thanks again to Ground News for their continued support of this channel. Now let's get to the transcript. The second leaked conversation involved Yuri Ushakov, one of the Kremlin's top foreign policy advisors, who was Witkoff's counterpart on the primary leak. Ushakov was speaking to Kirill Dmitriev, the Kremlin's designated negotiator who has been working with Witkoff on a Ukraine peace plan. The subject of the conversation was just that, what Russia ought to submit to the United States as a roadmap to a negotiated settlement. There are a lot of Russian salutations, an abundance of fluff, and some confusing interjections in the transcript. So I'm going to edit out all of the filler and only cover the critical parts now. Ushakov: we need to do as much as possible. What do you think? Dmitriev: I think this paper, we'll just make it as our position, and I'll just informally pass it on. Here meaning pass it on to Witkoff. He is essentially agreeing with Ushakov to make the proposal aspirational, and then afterward, as Dmitriev continues, let the United States do it as their own, with do here meaning edit or amend. Dmitriev one more time. But I don't think they'll take our version completely, but at least as close as possible. Yushakov. Well, that is the thing. They might not take it, and say it's been agreed with us. That's what I'm afraid of. Here, Yushakov is worried that Trump, or someone else, will amend the proposal and unilaterally say that Russia supports it, removing any further agency from the Kremlin in shaping the proposal. Dmitriev to conclude, No, that is exactly what I'll do, meaning that he is going to follow through on submitting Russia's position as described earlier. Here is where we have to start doing some detective work. We know from reports either exactly what it is that Dmitriev submitted, or something very close to it. That was the 28-point plan that we have analyzed at length already, that Western analysts concluded was basically a Ukrainian surrender document. And, in an ironic twist given Dmitriev's concerns that the United States would twist it and claim that Russia agreed to all of the changed terms, it seems that Dmitriev may have been the one to leak it in an attempt to pass it off as a proposal that the United States signed off on. Anyway, the point is that the deal is close to, or actually is, what Russia views as doing as much as possible, and as their position. Visualizing what that means, take a hypothetical expected military outcome of the war, represent Ukraine's cost of fighting as the space between the yellow and white lines, and represent Russia's cost of fighting as the space between the red and white lines. Then the best feasible settlement for Russia is at the yellow line. Trying to extract more than that is actually worse for Moscow, because Ukraine would prefer to fight, and the value of that for Russia falls back to the red line. In other words, the yellow line represents Russia's maximum demand. And thanks to the combination of the leaked phone call and the leaked peace plan, we know what Russia thinks the yellow line looks like. Take all of the Donbass, extract economic investment from the United States, limit Ukraine and the West's military presence in the Russian near abroad, and everything else from that 28-point plan. I say think here because, in practice, calculating an opposing side's likelihood of victory and how it internalizes the costs of war is not simple. But how Russia is calculating that expectation is still enough for us to draw a couple of critical implications. 1. Recall the long-running perception that Putin's tenure is at risk if Russia does not receive substantial concessions at the bargaining table, such as the entirety of the Donbass. Conceivably, this is because Putin signed into Russian law the annexation of the Donbass and is domestically locked into the situation. Now, for this conversation, let's ignore how Zaporizhia and Kherson were also, but are no longer on the bargaining table. The idea itself, as a theoretical concept, checks out. Indeed, such domestic weakness is actually a strength in coercive bargaining. As I alluded to earlier, to get a deal done, Ukraine would have to compensate for Putin's vulnerability by offering more concessions. According to this theory, that weakness is why we constantly see Russia pushing for a huge territorial shift. Anything less would not be politically feasible in Moscow. It is the modern-day version of Germany continuing World War I, because a sensible early settlement would have spelled the end of its political system. But that is not at all the framing of the private phone call between Dmitriev and Yushakov. This is not some deal that the Kremlin is just barely willing to accept. It is not some deal that the Kremlin thinks is equitable. It is a home run maximum that awards all of the benefits of a settlement to Russia and denies all of them to Ukraine. The second main takeaway is that, in light of the previous logic, there is no reason for Ukraine to accept the deal. Even if Ukraine will not extract all of the benefits of peace for itself, there is no reason to give them all to Russia when you could expect some division of the benefits between the two. To be clear, this is not a Putin is done revelation that will allow Ukraine to enforce a line matching the January 2022 border, never mind the January 2014 border. But there is still a big difference between Ukraine handing over the entire Donbass to Russia and Ukraine holding on to its fortress belt. And I am not just referring to the second-order effects of such concessions altering the balance of power in Russia's favor. The cost of losing the territory by itself is enough of a reason to reject the proposal. Okay, what I want to do now is spend some time discussing how Ukraine and Europe can go about improving their share of that peace surplus. It is worth noting that the average European diplomat took the leak of the peace plan in stride, as compared to the Western alarmist reactions on social media. They knew that this deal was something that no one was going to accept, and so there was no reason to panic. Europe did meet to craft a counterproposal, which is something that I said last week was important for taking back agenda-setting power. However, it was ultimately just as much for public consumption as it was for their own political maneuvering. And indeed, eventually Rubio's team met with Ukraine and seemed to get some moderation on where a potential deal was going, even if those bilateral talks came with their own fair share of pain. Still, there is a long-term risk that Europe loses agenda-setting power here. That is why the day that the 28-point peace plan leaked was a bad one for European diplomats, even if it was not a full-blown crisis. There are also reports that the private phone calls with European leaders included conversations about how it is important to not let the United States guide the peace process alone. Which, yes. But that should have been clear 10 months ago in the Oval Office. So we should mind the difference between Europe insisting it take greater control and Europe formulating a real plan to take control. So, if you will permit me, here are a couple of paths that Europe could take to solidify its position. This will largely amount to creating more political pressure in the United States. At least half of the Trump administration wants to get a deal done as fast as possible. If that means imposing a settlement that disproportionately benefits Russia, then so be it. If it means imposing conditions on Ukraine that ultimately hurts Ukraine, then so be it. Thus, the game being played is how to empower the other half, the one that cares about what the settlement looks like and is willing to stall things out if it means a better deal for Ukraine. Well, the best way to empower anyone who sides with Ukraine is to spend more money sending arms to Ukraine. But let's try to focus our attention on things that do not involve as much money, and in turn will not be the subject of bureaucratic gridlock. The easiest strategy is to simply amplify the main message from this video. We now know the Kremlin's maximalist demands, which implies that there are smaller demands that Russia will accept, and so we also know that there is no reason to grant those maximalist demands. The better, but harder strategy is one not publicly available at this time, but someone in the West likely has the ability to quickly make publicly available. Remember that Yushakov is the common thread from both of the leaks, which means his phone was likely compromised. Moreover, the entity that compromised the phone was almost certainly a pro-Ukraine Western actor. I know there has been some speculation that it was an extremist inside of Russia who leaked the phone call to sabotage any negotiations. Of course, that is possible. But it is weird that a Russian extremist would want to burn Witkoff, who would, in the long run, be more useful if he had not lost so much credibility in such a public way. It also does not make sense for a Russian to leak the second phone call. Indeed, divulging the second phone call only makes sense if you want to undermine Russia's bargaining position. A Western actor would want to do that. Russian extremists would not. Thus, the leaker was almost certainly from the West, and in turn, the intel collection was also from the West. That would suggest that more Yushakov phone transcripts exist. And if they do, then there is a good chance that there is some discussion of what Russia's minimum demands are in conversations between Yushakov and other Kremlin officials. Visually, I am talking about the Red Line, which is the best feasible division for Ukraine. Now, I do not want to suggest that Yushakov or someone else read out the literal minimum on a phone call. Where that actually falls would be Putin's final decision. Putin might not want to communicate that to his officials, and if he did say something to that effect, there is still no guarantee that he was being completely honest with his own people. Regardless, Western intelligence likely has some idea where that might be. Declassifying that phone call would help coordinate the West to stick to the corresponding proposal, no matter how much the Kremlin protests. After all, if the intelligence says that the Kremlin will accept it, then why should the West offer any more? And why should the West give in to the Kremlin's counterproposals when they know that they will take less. Ordinarily, the trade-off here would be that divulging the information would cut the future flow of intelligence from the corresponding source. The bargaining advantage gained by leveraging political agenda-setting power might not be as useful as, say, overhearing conversations about how much damage has been done to oil refineries and which ones are about to restart production. So you do not exploit the intelligence that you have, so that you can exploit the other thing even more. However, the means of acquisition are likely compromised at this point. The common thread of Yushikov's phone should have resulted in a complete change in his telecoms afterward. In turn, there should be little downside here. So, declassify the intelligence and solidify the West's bargaining position. The one wrench in that plan is if the leak came from inside the United States. That is fully possible. Remember, there is half of a Trump administration who does not like this situation, and there are untold numbers of people working elsewhere in the bureaucracy who are even more frustrated with the system. There is also the bit about how it seems that the United States had completely broken into the Kremlin's internal thought process during the Biden administration, meaning there is a good chance that the information is still flowing. If this is what happened, then the leaker had to break US law to release the first two transcripts. This was not part of a European plot that was government approved. Breaking the law again risks further exposure, which means they may want to stay quiet, and we will never hear directly about the Kremlin's minimum demands. Meanwhile, I have no minimum demands. Just my personal thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Go to ground.news/linesonmaps or scan the QR code on your screen to get 40% off a Vantage plan. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.